get started. Good afternoon, everybody. We're so excited to have you. My name's Claire Wardle, and I co-direct the Information Futures Lab with
Stephanie Friedhoff, also co-director.
This afternoon, we have the most amazing honor to have 6 Brown alums who we have spent the day with and are really extraordinary and have many things to say. But we just wanted to introduce Dr. Dean Ajit Shah, who personally, 2 years ago, called me up and said, would you want to come to Brown? And I said, no offense, but I'm not a public health person. And he said, that's exactly the point. I want to bring information, tech policy, misinformation, all of these challenges that we've just seen during the pandemic, and put it in the School of Public Health. And I'm sure going to talk about it today, about what Brown thinks about and how it does the kind of work that it does, because it's interdisciplinary. But we just wanted to bring Dean Shah up. He needs no introduction. As somebody just said, he's the man from TV. He's a global leader driving public health research, policy, and practice, which is exactly what we do, and joined the Brown School of Public Health as Dean only in September 2020. An accomplished and practicing physician, Dr. Shah is recognized globally as a trusted expert on major issues impacting public health and a catalyst for new thinking and approaches. For anybody who's been in a meeting with Ajit, you know that he is a catalyst for getting things done. A long-time leader on pandemic preparedness and response, from directing groundbreaking research on Ebola to serving on the front lines of COVID response. He has led national and international analysis of key issues and advised local and federal policymakers around the world. Most importantly, President Joe Biden appointed Dr. Shah as White House COVID-19 response coordinator in March 2022. We said goodbye to him, describing him as one of the leading public health experts in America. He's received bipartisan praise for his pragmatic approach to public health that, in the words of President Biden, translates complex scientific challenges into concrete actions that help improve millions of lives, which I think is also the way that we want to think about tech policy. It has very similar missions. So, Dean Shah, we'd love to hear from you.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to keep my remarks very short. And yes, I'm the guy from TV. I like that, actually. There's something very familiar about it. So I just want to take a couple of minutes to talk about why we started the Information Futures Lab here. I had this mental model before the pandemic began, and it's going to come across as both quaint and incredibly naive, but I'm going to share it. My mental model was, in the middle of a crisis, get scientists to figure out what the sort of best answer is at any given moment. You communicate it to the public, and the public listens and trusts that information and acts on it, and we're all in much, much better shape. And that was sort of my thinking about how we were going to get through this pandemic. And I think very, very early on came to realize we lived in an information ecosystem that I did not understand, I did not recognize. We, in fact, did not live in one information ecosystem, that we all lived in different information ecosystems, we all consumed information differently, and that we had to think differently about pretty much every aspect of the pandemic response and every aspect of public health. So when I got here to Brown, at the School of Public Health, I realized this was a really complex problem where we needed fresh thinking and a whole different approach. And so I had the fortune of working with Stephanie for years at Harvard, recruited her to Brown, and then had the very, very good fortune of also being able to engage Claire, whose first response was, I'm not a public health person, I don't spend my life thinking about public health per se. I mean, she'd done public health things, but she'd also worked on a whole lot of other things. And I think what the Information Futures Lab has done in the last year and a half that it has existed is extraordinary. There is a lot of things to talk about. I will tell you one of the biggest insights I've had from their work, really learning from them, is, again, thinking about like mental models for information. My mental model for sharing information is you wake up and you think, okay, what are the information needs that people have? And then how do we deliver it? And you think about how do you deliver it with simplicity and straightforwardness and authenticity, and how do you get trusted voices to deliver that message? It's all supply side. It's all like, what's the information we can supply to people? And I realized I was not thinking about the demand side of this. Like, what's on people's minds? What are people thinking about? What are they worried about? And so when you don't do that, it is of no surprise that the information you provide people often doesn't land, because you're not actually addressing the concerns that's on their minds. And that insight certainly changed the way I began to communicate when I was in federal government at the White House. I think it has begun to change the way I think about public health messaging more broadly. But it has also meant that we have a tremendous amount of work to do to really understand information needs of individuals, of communities, of families, of people around the world, and then to figure out how do we begin to deliver information to people in a way that is both trusted and useful. So I am super excited about this discussion. Thank you all for taking time. You guys all have extraordinarily busy lives, and so taking time to come to Brown and sharing with us how you're thinking about these issues. I will tell you that from my perspective, it's become very clear that a government-based approach where we're going to set out rules and laws and regulations to fix these issues is not happening. It's certainly not going to happen anytime soon. And so the solutions around kind of misinformation, bad information, how it proliferates, is going to come from civil society, it's going to come from universities, it's going to come from companies who are going to think about how to deliver better information to people. And so no better group to talk about that than this panel. And Claire, I'm going to turn it back over to you. Thank you all for being here today. I'm really excited about this conversation.
Okay, so if I just read out their bios, that would be the end. So I just said to them, can we just quickly go down the table and for them to just very quickly describe what it is that they do every day? That's what's interesting. And if they've got like a fun Brown memory or something they want to say, that wouldn't be a bad thing. But yeah, can I start with you, Jessica?
Yeah, of course. Is this on?
I don't think it's on. Do we press the
You have to
button?
press it like the UN.
No, it should come on.
Nope.
All right, are we on now?
I have a man
Are we on now?
doing this.
Yeah?
Yes.
Oh, there it is.
Magic.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dean. Thank you, Claire. It's such a pleasure to be here. Jessica Ashooh, Brown 06. I'm the Senior Director for Policy at Reddit. I've been at Reddit for 6.5 years now, and before that, I had a totally different career in Middle East security and diplomacy, which isn't at all related to anything I've had to do lately. And would love to, talk about how that career transition happened for those of you who are thinking about different career paths. Let's see, fun Brown memory. I don't know, you probably still have the lecture board around. I was the vice president of the lecture board, and so it was fun. You got to entertain the speakers, and I don't know if you all know who Ben Stein is. He's the teacher in Ferris Bueller. So he came and gave a lecture, and I got to walk him around Thayer Street. And this guy, my goodness, he wanted to go to every store on Thayer Street and get hamburgers and milkshakes. So we did that.
And what was your concentration here?
International relations. With I think the concentration has changed a little bit, but with a focus on global security and regional focus on the Middle East.
Thank you. Katie.
Of course. Hi, I'm Katie Barr. I'm the COO and Executive Vice President of the Glen Group. We're a public affairs firm in D.C., headquartered in D.C., offices in Chicago and Amsterdam as well. We essentially take complicated tech issues and translate them into successful coalitions and advocacy to educate policymakers and regulators and press and the public with the hope of creating better policy outcomes, right? So I come at it from an education and kind of storytelling perspective. I am a Brown 07 graduate, and I think I've got a lot of memories, some worth sharing here, some not worth sharing here. But I won an Ivy League championship ring my junior year in basketball, which was pretty cool.
And what did you concentrate in? Because I'm trying to make a point here.
Political science and public policy.
Thank you.
I'm Daphne Keller. I direct the program on platform regulation at Stanford's Cyber Policy Center. Before that, I was a lawyer for Google for 10 years. I ran the legal team for web search, dealt with a lot of really interesting legal issues around the world. And I was, what do I do all day? Nowadays, I try to spot topics in policy debates or things I think are coming in policy debates that are misunderstood and in need of more analysis, and do academic work trying to plug holes, providing usually legal or practical analysis, and then make that be a tool for myself or other people in policy advocacy work and in litigation and in human rights environments, et cetera. I was a double major in history and modern culture and media. both of those things are super relevant to what I do today, and were also, I think, quite relevant to what I did as a practicing lawyer, and definitely relevant to the path to how I wound up here. So don't dis-MCM anyone.
Matt.
I'm Matt Peralt. I direct a center on tech policy at UNC Chapel Hill, and I am a consultant on tech policy issues, so I spend my days writing policy briefs and then talking to policymakers about them, and then helping tech companies to realize their public policy hopes and dreams and avoid their public policy nightmares. I was a political science major here at Brown. I have zillions of really happy memories here. It was a happy time for me. But I think the thing coming back that is so meaningful is less remembering a specific thing that I did in a specific place and more the feeling on the campus and on the streets around here, which is just so beautiful, and it's such a wonderful place to think deeply about things and learn. So I'm jealous of all of you that you get to do that every day.
And what was your concentration?
Political science.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Samm Sachs. I'm a senior fellow at Yale Law School's Tsai China Center, where I spend most of my time testifying to Congress, studying China's data laws and regulations, and writing a book right now on the geopolitics of cross-border data flows and data security. I also am a consultant primarily to US tech firms, helping them navigate the tech regulatory environment in China. I remember coming to the Watson Institute as a student for a small seminar taught in Chinese by a dissident who had just been released from solitary confinement in China, about the Tiananmen Square massacre. And after the first seminar, a group of us who were all studying Chinese together took him roller skating at a local, I don't know, maybe not in Providence, it's a roller skating rink in Rhode Island. And he had been in solitary confinement for years, and his daughter and grandchild were living here in Rhode Island. And I remember seeing him go around the roller rink with his family, and it was incredibly powerful.
Wow, that's a story. Z, follow up.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Steve Sanderson, class of 2015. My concentration was political science, and I think I was one class short in religious studies, and then took a bunch of math, all of which continue to be relevant to what I do today. I'm the executive director of the NYU Center for Social Media and Politics. We're a computational research center of, at this point, just over 20 researchers and staff at NYU that studies everything that we're going to sort of talk about here today, but very much from the computational side. My role is sort of split into two parts as executive director. About half my time I do research, the other half of my time I work with this growing ecosystem of other stakeholders who cares about grounding their work in the best empirical evidence that we have. I also consult on the side with international NGOs, trying to bring some of this research to civil society actors on the ground. I also played basketball at Brown. We absolutely did not win an Ivy League championship when I was here. But my memory today walking around campus was I was a tour guide, and I had random Brown facts just entering my memory that I hadn't thought about in 9 years.
So I would love to stick with this education piece, right? Because I think universities struggle with this topic because it moves at such speed. So now universities are how on earth do we teach AI? And by the time we've written our syllabus, it'll be different next month. But I think there's something very specific about your experiences at Brown and what you know now about understanding the issues that you think about. So what would you say to students or to educators in the room about what you learned at Brown that you still use now, or how should we be thinking about this from a very interdisciplinary perspective? Does anybody want to go first? And you don't have to answer all the questions, but
Me?
you go, Sam, because you were talking earlier about sitting in the Rockefeller Library going over Chinese texts.
Yeah.
I mean, so talk to us a little bit about your education, how you've ended up here.
So I neglected to say earlier, my major in Brown, or concentration, was literary translation in the comparative literature department. And so for my senior thesis, I translated essays by women writers writing autobiographical pieces during China's Cultural Revolution. And now I'm focused on the tech policy dynamics between the US and China. But I think my academic grounding was as a student of literature and linguistics and language. And I was trying, I think similar to what Daphne said about how she draws on her background in humanities, I think every day in my work, I'm continuing to look at primary source texts. There's a lot of people will reference all the time, well, China's national security law says. And I want to say, well, have you read, Article 4 of this law or that regulation in Chinese? Or have you actually worked with a company who's complying with it on the ground? Because I am doing that daily. And I think when we look at the sort of body of laws and regulations that are coming out of China on AI, on data, it is very much a linguistic exercise, and it's a political exercise of understanding what that means in the context of a complex political system. A colleague of mine likes to refer to what she calls the sweet and sour of Chinese laws. If you look at, for example, China issued a draft regulation on generative AI. And if you were to read it blind, and I think about my course in political theory with Professor Corey Brettschneider at Brown, and one of the things I remember was reading Rawlsian political theory about what it means to evaluate the laws of a society if you evaluate it blind. So pretend that you don't know who you are in that society. What would you think of that law or regulation? So sometimes I do that when I'm reading Chinese laws and regulations, but I do it blind as if, what if I didn't know this was a Chinese regulation? When you read China's generative AI regulation, one of the early articles starts out with, it is important to maintain the social order and not seed unrest or social instability or extremist terrorist views. And you think, okay, this is clearly a regulation that's coming out of an authoritarian political system that is using technology to cement the rule of the Communist Party of China. Then you read further in the law and you find all kinds of language that if we didn't know it was from China, mirrors the language in the White House commitments on AI that have to do with concerns that sort of digital rights groups in the US are debating. So how do we sort of make sense of that push and pull and that contradiction, and what does that mean? And I think I'm constantly drawing on my background as a student of literature and the humanities to make sense of that.
And I can jump in. So my academic career at Brown and in grad school was all very, very focused on traditional diplomacy and international relations. So immediately after Brown, I won a Marshall Scholarship and went to Oxford and did a master's in international relations and then turned that into a PhD in international relations, all very, very focused on traditional statecraft and foreign policy in the Middle East. That's what I wanted to do. And then after grad school, that's what I did do. I got a very interesting opportunity to go and work in the Foreign Ministry of the United Arab Emirates in Abu Dhabi. And I moved to Abu Dhabi about 2 weeks before the Arab Spring touched off, and so that was all just very, very fascinating for someone who was a student of regional politics and the foreign policies of the region. In my day-to-day job at Reddit now, so being director of policy at Reddit means that one of my main roles is to be the company's main voice and representative to governments around the world. And as you all know, because you're here, governments around the world are really interested in tech policy and what platforms are doing. And so it's awesome because I kind of get to be like the Secretary of State, but for a company. And so, last month I was in Australia. I went to Canberra and spoke to parliamentarians and their Minister of Communications. I went to New Zealand and spoke with, members of their parliament about terrorist issues and all of the same things that I was working on in government, but now just doing so from a private sector perspective. So what I like to tell students is to not shut off the private sector as an option. I certainly didn't consider it when I was your age, and it was a very unexpected career transition for me, but it's been wonderful. And my knowledge of international relations and statecraft and how it works has been so enriched by kind of doing it from the non-state kind of international corporation perspective.
And Matt, can I just pick on you a little bit as somebody who, you didn't say in your bio, but it is on there, that you did work at Facebook.
Yeah.
And you said earlier that there was sometimes some pretty big decisions and tricky decisions. What kind of things in those moments as a public policy person were you drawing on to try and make some of those decisions?
So I think just because of the question you asked a couple of minutes ago, I assume you mean what are the components of an educational background that prepare you?
You weren't a computer scientist.
So partly to be provocative, but I think it's sort of true. I don't feel like I had very much to draw on. And that, I felt like I had a very strong undergraduate education at Brown, but I went to a public policy school that didn't really, it was also like fun and I learned tons of stuff, but did it prepare me for like many or any of the decisions that I faced in that job? I don't think so. My learning in public policy was really rooted in showing up at Facebook bright-eyed and really wanting to understand, like, what does it mean to do public policy work? What does it mean to do it well? What does it mean to do it poorly? Like, what is the craft of this? And that was all learned on the fly. And my passion coming back into academia was to try to provide some of the public policy education that I felt like I didn't get in terms of like that just kind of pragmatic decision-making expertise or understanding or approach. Because I think like when you're in the position of helping companies make decisions or making decisions on your own, like pointing out that a problem is hard is like not really, that's not adding a ton of value. The question is like when you have usually a set of problematic bad options, like which is the one that you choose? What are the costs that you're prepared to bear? And I just had never been pushed into inhabiting that kind of a position. So I don't teach now, but when I taught, I really tried to do like a lot of simulation work to put students in the position of not just articulating what a difficult problem looked like, but actually trying to make decisions. And I felt like that was really challenging. Like it was challenging because I think it's just hard to do that well. And also because I didn't feel like, at least in the institution that I was teaching in, that there were a community of people who were working together to try to provide that opportunity to students. And I'm not saying like that should be the exclusive opportunity for students, but I thought it was really important to have some practitioners providing some of that. And I didn't see much of it, and I didn't see much focus on like cultivating that as a pedagogy.
Yeah, and just to move on, I think, let's just talk about the horrors of the last 2 weeks. I mean, I've been doing this work for 20 years, and trying to navigate the current information environment is incredibly hard. And I spoke to somebody recently who was talking about, our flag emojis hate speech, like long conversations in public policy teams right now to say, what does it mean if somebody responds to an Israeli mother saying they've lost their son with a Palestinian flag or vice versa? Like, I think to your point, like we can only teach so much, and then things happen and you suddenly, there isn't a playbook for this kind of stuff. So I just would be interested in any of your thoughts about this moment, how you think platforms are responding, and certainly don't say anything you can't say, but just in this moment as people who think and care deeply about these issues, how do we think the platforms are doing, and is really anything can be done on the most complex and difficult issue really on the planet? So who wants to take that softball question?
So I am not close to what platforms are doing in this difficult moment, but I've been in some previous difficult moments, and I think part of the answer is in a moment of crisis, people do change their rules from the rules they had before, or they change their expectations, and then hopefully afterwards, you pause and recalibrate and decide if the thing you did in a crisis is the thing you want to be permanent. As a legislative matter, this is kind of the USA Patriot Act as a response to 9/11 that then led to all these surveillance issues, is an example of that. So, something that I testified about in a district court in Jerusalem once was when the Benghazi riots were happening, there was a video on YouTube that was believed to be the cause of the riots. It was a short film that was offensive enough in English, but then when it was dubbed into Arabic and you couldn't tell that these actors weren't even really saying what it claimed they were saying, it became even worse. And what YouTube wound up doing was they'd already ascertained that this didn't violate their rules. But then when there are people coming to you saying there's a riot right now, people are dying because of this video, you need to take it down, they took it down on an emergency basis. They kept it down in the countries where it turned out it violated that country's laws. And then they put it back up once sort of the riot was over and after thinking about it more carefully. And so that's like a platform side of it. And I imagine a lot of sort of crisis changes to policy that then maybe they rethink, or maybe they decide this was a good change to policy. We hadn't been tested on this before, and now that we have been tested, we want to change the rules. I think a similar thing is happening inside of government. So I've been on Twitter a lot criticizing Thierry Breton of the European Commission for the letters that he's been sending to platforms that I think wildly overstate the authority that he has on this new EU law, the Digital Services Act, or DSA. This is a freshly enacted law. It's not even in effect yet for smaller platforms like Reddit. It is in effect for the biggest platforms. And during its negotiation, a lot of human rights groups, and particularly groups from the Global South, said we're really worried about the authority that this law seems to be granting the government over speech. We're afraid it's ripe for abuse. And the proponents of the law were like, no, there are all these constraints. It's really safe. That, there's a process before the government can assert any authority over speech. And then, bam, like right out of the gate, first during the Paris riots and now in the past week or so, Commissioner Breton has been sending these letters insisting that he does have all that authority. And that, similarly, I hope this is a crisis. People do things, maybe they want to walk back later in a crisis. I hope it gets walked back. But it's just rules change and people's expectations change in a moment like this.
Yeah, I can jump on this, given it's my area of expertise, and I have been, responding to this with the team at Reddit the last several days. It's an example of how expertise that you think may be unrelated can really be useful. I'm our company's subject matter expert on this issue, just given my previous career. I'm an Arabic speaker, so I can, help with understanding kind of the nuance of particular videos and things. But what's been really fascinating for me is I think that this is the first war of its nature where so much of it has been online. Even thinking back to like the Syrian civil war, a lot of that was online, but you didn't have, that was a civil war. And so you didn't have the components of different sides in the same way that we do today. And there's a lot of complications, but the one thing that's very, very clear, especially in EU law, is that content from designated foreign terrorist organizations is illegal, and we have to keep that off our platforms. And so that's been a major priority. We've been keeping that off, taking it down. But one of the things that's been really shocking for me is seeing the conspiracy theories around that, because the wildest thing that I saw was people saying that we are supporters of Hamas because we're taking down all of the Hamas videos and therefore trying to whitewash their crimes, which, it's wild to me and just proves that, people will come up with a narrative about anything. But it also, there is a kernel of interest there for people who think about these things from a public policy perspective where, the strict illegality in many jurisdictions of terrorist content does change the, the views and narratives that you get online. And let me be clear, terrorist narratives do not deserve to be online, but it does raise the question of what types of stories are represented versus others. And, I think that it's just an interesting data point for lawmakers.
Steve, do you want to come?
Yeah, so I think that there are sort of two sets of questions here when it comes to thinking about what's occurring online right now around this conflict. The first are these normative questions, which you started with, Claire. How should we think of an emoji of a flag? The second is a set of descriptive questions, which as a computational social scientist is the contribution that we can make, which is what's actually occurring online. I think one of the unique challenges of studying the sort of information environment right now during this particular horrific conflict is that the data access regimes that had sort of structured the ability for independent researchers to get data in previous conflicts have largely shifted. And so platforms like Twitter that were much more open, from which we could get fairly large scale granular data, are now completely, or not completely, but effectively completely closed. Reddit, slightly more challenging, though still possible. YouTube, TikTok have never been particularly good. And so, at our best, we would want the sort of normative questions and the descriptive questions to be in conversation with each other, for what we think should happen to be in conversation with what we, the best sort of rigorous research can tell us about what is occurring. But right now, at least on the research side, it's very, very challenging to even get the sort of basic data that we would need to bring some rigorous evidence to bear in this conversation. Another way of thinking about this is when we study social media platforms, which we do at NYU, they're massive and the data are sort of optimized for search, which makes studying numerators very easy and denominators very hard. So if you want to go online and find evidence of a particular behavior, you can not only find evidence of that, but you can probably find a lot of evidence of that because there are a lot of people online. If you want to try to contextualize that within the entire ecosystem of what people are like how people are behaving and what sort of information they're getting, that's much more difficult and requires a completely different set of data access regimes, which right now, unfortunately, are sort of not at play.
So, Katie, I want to bring you in onto another question that you often hear, maybe around the Thanksgiving dinner table or in Uber, which is, if everybody's IDs were connected to their presence on the internet, we wouldn't have any problems. And this question of the right to be anonymous on the internet or the right to encrypted messaging is something that we're hearing quite a lot, and we often hear in kind of like regulatory circles. Like, how do you try and explain to policymakers this challenge about anonymity or encryption to people who want to make a case and say, what, child sexual abuse imagery is on WhatsApp, of course it shouldn't be.
God, this is such an impossible debate. Yes, right. I think encryption is the building blocks of the internet, right? And I think that we've seen this a lot where do I want to give people every tool they possibly can to find a child sexual abuser? Yes. Do I want to help all of these groups do these things? Yes, but at what cost? Matt talked about this earlier, about this push-pull between tech and law enforcement, right? Or tech and CSAM groups or what have you, right? Who want to do the right thing, but assume that tech does nothing because they can't do everything here, right? And I think we're seeing a lot of threats to encryption around the globe, here, UK, Brazil, Australia a little bit, right? So there's a lot to be concerned about with encryption from where I sit. I think, like, for me, it comes down to, breaking encryption for anybody harms online safety for everybody, and until there's a technical solution to that, that's kind of where I sit.
And Daphne, do you have any thoughts on this as somebody, my own country is having lots of debates about encryption and messaging apps?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, the members of Congress and staffers who are all communicating with each other on Signal,
yes, with disappearing messages,
about how we shouldn't have encryption anymore, it's complicated. I kind of want to push back on the starting point, and this goes partly to encryption and partly to things like Facebook's Real ID policy of, like, should everybody have to have their identity tied to their online speech? I think there are a lot of, especially LGBTQ plus rights groups, that see a lot of danger in that, in forcing people to disclose who they are online and not be able to, seek information anonymously or speak about their experiences without risking being victimized. So there's sort of, where you sit really affects, I think, how you respond to the idea that it would be better if all of us, it was publicly known who we are every time we speak online.
I think this is also an example where there's silos of tech policy conversations happening. So I'm primarily in the US-China conversation, which is very removed from the debates around encryption that are happening in other realms of tech policy. But I noticed that there was a bill introduced by Senator Wyden, which seems to have died, but it captures a sentiment in the administration and in Congress right now, which is there's a growing movement to restrict Chinese platforms or other global platforms from transferring American sensitive data to China. And in the Wyden bill, which would make data an export controlled item for certain quote unquote foreign adversary nations, they put an exemption in there which said you can transfer Americans' data to these foreign adversary countries if it's encrypted to NIST encryption standards. And I found that so interesting because there's a lot of conversation about putting up guardrails around what countries have access to Americans' data or not. None of this is resolved. It's still under debate among policymakers in Washington. But the Wyden bill, which I'm not endorsing, and I find actually there was a lot of problems with it, but I found the reference to encryption really interesting because while there's so much focus on who has access to data and what's the ownership of the company or the recipient, there's less focus on, well, how do we better protect the data itself, regardless of where it's going? And encryption, I think, has a really important role to play in that conversation and just hasn't been as discussed as much because I think it's a separate silo of policy debate. But I would love to hear and have further study of how it could play a role in this moment of digital sovereignty concerns around the world.
This microphone placement seems rooted in the idea that Daphne and I should get to know each other better than we currently
You could potentially move it.
which is a win. Sorry, I'll just go over here. So I think like one of the interesting dynamics around this issue, as well as many others, is kind of an idea that like you would aim for homogeneity across platforms, and like if you make one decision for one platform, that might be the right decision for others. When I started at Facebook, we were like very much a real name identity platform and had more, I would say, censorious speech policies than Twitter, which was not a real name policy platform and was more of a open speech platform. And I thought that was like the decisions that we made about that were the right decisions for us. And I also thought it was very good for internet users that Twitter had a very different approach. And I think that's like an important thing to keep in mind. I'm sort of interested in your thoughts on like how the DSA would interplay with those kinds of things or other regulations. Because like there are regulations that sort of, I think, reduce the opportunity to compete as aggressively as content moderators or as in terms of the kind of identity or privacy offerings that a platform might provide. And I think encryption is a good example of that. My hope would be there would always be room for some encrypted services, and also it will never be the case that all services are encrypted.
I feel like, Jessica, you might have some thoughts as you run a company that loves and allows it very much.
Oh yeah, no, we feel, this is something we feel hugely strongly about. Reddit is not necessarily a real name platform. We like to say that you get to share as much of your identity or as little of your identity as you feel comfortable with. So there are some people who come on and they say like, hey, this is me, this is who I am, and then others stay anonymous. We also let you have multiple accounts because sometimes you don't want to talk about your struggles with addiction in the same account where you post cat videos, and that's totally fine. We can have different identities online, and that's healthy, and we want to be able to encourage that. We collect a lot less data about our users, kind of in respect of that value of privacy. And I think that that's really important because Matt was saying, different platforms have different approaches to these things depending on their business model. So I spend a lot of time talking with lawmakers around the world about the importance of anonymity and trying to bring it home because, the conversation that we're having in the West is very different than the conversation that you're having in more authoritarian countries, where anonymity is essential to being able to criticize your government or, more mundane things like, new parents talking about the struggles bonding with their infant child, just stuff that you may not want your real world identity tied to. And we need to have those spaces to be able to do so. And we were really proud. Earlier this year, there was a Supreme Court case that you all might have heard about called Gonzalez v. Google. And we put in an amicus brief in that case. And we included the voices of Reddit moderators because this would have impacted how they moderate their communities. And to my knowledge, this was the first time that this had ever happened, that the Supreme Court had ever allowed this, but they allowed us to include those moderators anonymously. So they signed our brief with their Reddit usernames, which I thought was really cool and just an illustration of how deeply we care about people contributing to the debate, but doing so on their own terms and with only the identity that they feel comfortable with sharing.
I mean, I just think as an issue, it plays into so many of the conversations we're having that it's not monolithic. It's important that people understand the subtleties and complexities. But yeah, I hear all the time, none of these problems would exist if we put our driver's license in here. So we're going to open this up to questions soon, so start thinking about them. And if you're on the live stream, we have a hashtag IFL panel. Or if you're sitting there and you'd rather just use your phone than stand up at a microphone, feel free to do that. We have a Google Doc. But I would also just want to have a thought for a second about, we know that many communities of color and marginalized communities are more affected by platforms. Yet we know that in many platform settings, we have fewer people who represent those communities. And, we can make a nod to this panel. Like, this is something that we all think deeply about. I mean, what's some of the ways that platforms, but also public affairs companies and universities teaching this, like, how can we think much more proactively about ensuring that we have people making policies who are representing the communities who are most harmed? So I don't know if anybody has thoughts or ideas.
I'll just say a quick thing on that, which I think at this point, anybody who is serious about trust and safety, meaning running the teams that moderate content and take things down, has figured out that if you don't have a diversity of people with different backgrounds and different experiences in the world, you will not spot issues accurately. You are not going to do a good enough job for your users if everyone who is making these decisions comes from, the same 10 elite universities or has very, limited experience of every kind of diversity that there is. I could rattle off examples. So I think there's just this very practical reality of the need for diverse perspectives in making that set of decisions.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we do at Reddit is, because this is often talked about as like a pipeline problem, which is only one of the issues, but we have an awesome internship program. So going back to what I said before, if anyone is interested in exploring a career in the private sector, check out our internships. But we also have a partnership with some HBCUs to try and diversify, the next generation of talent that's interested in Reddit.
I mean, also to that point, going back to what's happening in the Middle East, as somebody pointed out, and it's so interesting, you're an Arabic speaker, and so you're able to see this, but that actually a lot of the machine learning algorithms have had a lot of Arabic data trained on it, Hebrew being a much smaller language, less so. So even it's not just who's sitting around the table, but it's what are the data sets that we've had to train the algorithms around some of these things. So I'm just going to give people another 2 minutes to think of killer questions. But to your point about practical advice, I'm going to do a rapid fire down the line. What's one thing that if somebody's been like, this is interesting, I hadn't considered this, what would you recommend them thinking about or doing that might help them move into this space? And start with Zeev.
I'll do rapid fire, and I also want to say sort of a general comment. So the rapid fire on terms of what they can do genuinely is just at Brown to sort of stay deeply curious. I think what's sort of fascinating about the folks on this panel is that we all came from different disciplinary backgrounds. I ended up doing a lot of math here because I like to do math, and that led me to be able to go to grad school and then continue doing math in a research context. The other thing is, and I'm sorry I'm going to embarrass him, but what's fun about coming back to Brown is both getting the random tour guide facts that came to mind as walking around campus, also having my favorite formative professor come and see me talk. When I got into Brown, I reached out to an older classmate for some advice, and he gave me some advice, go to RISD parties, Blue Room muffins are good, and the other, which was by far the biggest gift, was take Professor Willis's class, who's in the back. So if any folks here haven't done it, really sort of life-changing stuff.
What's the class?
Lots of them. I think I took 4 of your classes.
Oh.
Yeah.
I think my number one advice is after you graduate, go live and work in another country. And ideally, if you're interested in tech, go work for a tech company in another country. Learn about it in practice. Could be a multinational, could be a local company. Gain some on-the-ground experience from a global perspective.
I was going to make a similar point. Jessica also raised it earlier about openness to working at a company, particularly if you feel like you are driven by a desire for public service and mission-oriented work. I would not exclude companies from the range of options that you might consider. Obviously, government work and civil society work, and there are many other ways to get that kind of public orientation. But I think many people assume that companies are exclusively focused on bottom line and money and not on serving users and trying to do things that are in the public good.
I'll do the lawyer version of this. So what I tell my law students is, if you're interested in being in-house at a company, being in civil society, being in government, or being in academia, any one of those roles will make you better at the other roles. Like, get moving around and seeing those different roles is incredibly productive. For people who are thinking of going to law school, if you can possibly go to a fancy law school that has loan repayment assistance, that will take the shackles off you, so optimize for that.
In a similar vein, like, think broadly, this ecosystem is bigger than tech companies and the government, right? That you can do a lot of good at a mission-focused company like mine, or a civil society group, or a think tank, or even the right law firm. And then this community is such a great one, but it's also not a huge one. And so talk to us, talk to others. If we can't point you in the right direction, we probably can find somebody who can.
And then I would say, like, it's so cliche, but like, do what you're passionate about, because when you're passionate, whether you think it's related to tech or not, you will be excellent at it. And excellence is something that you can sell in any industry, and it makes it easier to transfer between industries, because the reality is that, like, absolutely, this panel is an illustration of absolutely any subject under the sun can be applied to tech. There's a venture capitalist named Mark Andreessen, and he has, his saying is, software is eating the world. And like, it is. Absolutely anything has a tech component to it. So just like, do what you love and be excellent at it, and then find the tech angle.
So if you've got any questions, feel free to find a microphone. But would you mind coming to the microphone, just because we've got a live stream? But while you're doing that, just maybe I'll take one at a time so you can all think about it. But what is the most difficult or complex question or issue you have faced in your work? Well, I think you can go, lovely, because this has completely flummoxed them.
Okay. Hello. Okay. Hi. My name is Vanessa. I'm a current MPA student here at Brown. My question, thank you for being here today. I know from what most people have kind of garnered, is that there's a lot of political polarization that some people are kind of crediting to the algorithm that are on some of these social media platforms. There's some research into it. I guess it's not completely set in stone on whether it can be credited to that. But I guess I just want to hear a little bit about your experiences. Do you think that there are any, like, I guess, good policy, attempts to try to mitigate that? I know a lot of this has to deal with just the algorithm. A lot of these platforms look at how to engage the user to come back to the platform. And a lot of times people love to engage when there's something controversial at the table. So I know at the same time, like, these platforms have to operate in their best interest, but I know the government as well, there's been a lot of talk about ways to mitigate, like, increased polarization happening on these platforms. So whether it's like from personal work experience or even just your own thoughts, I'd love to hear a little bit about that.
Thanks for the question, Vanessa. It's really awesome. I think one of the important things to keep in mind here is that not all platforms are the same. Not all platforms use algorithms or use algorithms in the same way. And actually, the literature is really interesting when you compare, like, what I've seen is news media diets across platforms. And, I pay attention to the research on Reddit, and we've seen research that says when users are using Reddit, they actually get a more diverse media diet. So I think that there's a lot of elements of product design that we need to be really thoughtful about. And this is one of the questions, going back to the career things, when we talk about working in private companies, I think a lot of times people don't really understand what that means, or they think that, the only role for them, if they're interested in these questions of social importance, is being a policy person like me. But let me let you in on a secret. These tech companies are extremely product driven. And so the way that you're going to be a really attractive candidate is if you have the business wherewithal to be like a product manager, because that's what they need, but you have the liberal arts background or the policy background to be a product manager who makes good judgments and thinks about these things rather than just kind of putting the product out there or assuming that the policy team or the legal team is going to be the one who tells you, oh, here's a problem. That's going to, really set you up for success. And so, it's not the worst thing to consider things that would position you to be a product leader in a company, like a dreaded MBA or things like that. Like, there's a there are a lot of
Or a
pathways.
technical background.
Yeah,
You don't have
totally.
to be an MBA for
Yes,
this.
sure. Sorry, I said the evil word.
So I think there's sort of two questions here. So when it comes from like approaching this from a research perspective, the first is this sort of narrow framing of the question, which is, can we sort of design studies to try to understand whether algorithmic design on certain social media platforms directly impacts polarization? And I'm happy to send sort of papers after this. The best available evidence that we have now, and a broad generalization, is that it doesn't seem to. There's, I think, a second question, which methodologically is much more challenging to study, which is there sort of an algorithmically, is there an algorithmic media environment that has created incentives that intersect with sort of social, cultural, and institutional context that could have sort of, if not caused, then certainly contributed to polarization? That is like sort of methodologically a really challenging thing to study, and so there isn't really good data there. There is some correlative data that looks at things like the rise of social media across countries as it relates to polarization. And what's interesting is in the US, you do see a correlation between social media penetration and polarization. In other contexts, you don't, which for me sort of like, it's correlative, so it doesn't give us any causal purchase, but it does probably suggest that there's something about this sort of algorithmic media environment paired with this broader context that's doing something to polarization. But again, the best available research that we have, at least in the American context, around like, do algorithms seem to actually like directly contribute to polarization? The answer is no.
Great answers.
Hi there. Thank you for coming. I have a question about content moderation and the stage at which companies engage with it. So I think like for us in the general public, we tend to hear about these issues when they've become real crises and companies are facing a lot of heat for how they have or haven't handled it. So I'm wondering, do you think that there's a way in which these issues, before they become crises and you have to like be putting out all of these fires, that they can be seen beforehand? And is there a way to kind of preemptively guess or have a little bit of a head start on what kinds of issues might become crystallized into real crises? If so, how do you think you might do that? If not, maybe it's not an issue and actually just kind of putting out fires is better.
I mean, I'll make another plug for diversity on the teams, right? You're going to do a much worse job of spotting pending issues without that.
I'd sort of push in the reverse direction. I think a lot of what not on that on the idea that that companies are like not paying attention and then a crisis happens and then there's like that's like a good moment of policy work. I think actually what often can happen is kind of the inverse. So like often more junior people on teams do really deep work over a long period of time about how to think about an issue, and they come to a resolution about what they think is the best way to address that issue. And content moderation decisions are like filled with bad answers. There are always large volumes of content that you'll feel uncomfortable with, I think, even with a content moderation policy that is the right one overall. And then there will be a crisis, and then senior people will rush in and sort of blow up the work that team has done over a period of time to try to be responsive to a bunch of news stories that happened in the last 24 hours. It's sometimes the case that is a reversal of a policy in a good direction, and that like the crisis gave rise to issues that people should pay attention to and they weren't paying attention to. I think it's often the case that it's the inverse, that there are like individual policymakers or individual people in the press or something who are beating the drum on a particular issue, and they unwind this work that teams have done over a long period of time.
I know you've got a question. Can I just jump off a little bit on that, which is, I think many of us are concerned that we've seen companies move backwards around a lot of their content moderation decisions, from a position of like taking Donald Trump off the platform and having strong election integrity to a place now where I think many of us are nervous that there are fewer COVID misinformation policies, although that's a much bigger conversation about unsettled science and content moderation. But what are your thoughts about, I mean, maybe this is hard for you to answer, Jessica, but I think this question of content moderation, we've got more experience now, but yet I feel like we're in a less strong position.
So I don't. And again, I think that this is probably something that's very particular to individual platforms, right? Because, at Reddit, we're stronger than we've ever been on these issues because it's
You
been a
don't think
process.
Elon Musk has allowed other platforms to say we don't have to be as strict?
No, I mean, certainly not ours. Certainly not ours. And to a certain point, there's like we just moderate content so differently from Twitter or X because we involve, Reddit has a layered moderation system that gives probably the most agency of any platform to users. And we kind of have, we have the subreddit system that you can think of as a federal government. And so no matter, yes, we set a content policy at the top, and we're constantly iterating on that content policy, and we're very serious about enforcing it with our internal safety team. But we also have this federal system where the subreddit volunteer moderators can set their own rules that are more specific than what we have. And so like a great example on, scientific misinformation is in the r/science community. Those moderators have a rule that says the only thing you're allowed to link to in this community is a peer-reviewed scientific journal, and they automate their enforcement of that. We couldn't make that rule for all of Reddit, but it's great to have in the science community. I'm glad that they have it. And so I think that breaking down platforms into smaller, more governable spaces, and giving users agencies to be actors in their own governance is a really powerful way to take some of this power and give it back to the people. Because the reality is like platforms making decisions from the top for hundreds of millions of people, they're never going to have the correct answer. You have to allow for a kind of market-based federal approach where different communities can have different standards.
So we love Reddit, but can I just turn to the other platforms? Like, where do we think we are going into the 2024 election around some of the policies around the content that we might see?
I think it's odd sometimes that the same people express concerns like one after the other about platforms exercising. Sometimes people will say platforms need to use a stronger hand to moderate content. And then in the next sentence say, we're really concerned about aggregation of platform power. And those two things I think are somewhat at odds. I mean, I would go back to what I said before about like diversity of policies I think can be really valuable. That I think there is room, I think platforms overall have trended, first of all, toward convergence in content moderation policies to like all kind of having similar policies. I don't think that's good for users. I think users should have more choice about the nature of lots of components of platforms, including how they're moderated. And I think it's helpful. I don't use X extensively, so I am not one of the people who can tell you all the ways it's worse now than it was a year ago. But I do think moving to a world of significantly less censorious content moderation policies on at least some platforms is a positive thing. I think there are a lot of problematic use cases about how, about some of the content moderation practices that other platforms adopted before Musk took over Twitter that I think are like don't hold up well over time. So my hope would actually be like there would be some platforms that would have a Musk type approach and that other platforms would not follow that lead, and there'd be diversity and users could choose what content moderation practices are right for them.
Any thoughts, Daphne?
So I'll tell a story about what I think happened with Facebook, and it's probably a very caricatured story, but what I've seen over the arc of being out in academia and working with civil society groups and so forth a lot, and being in a lot of like closed door meetings with company reps and civil society is, first of all, we came out of an era when journalism was totally uncritically praiseful of tech platforms, and that was stupid. And then we moved into the techlash, where there was just a lot of uncritical condemnation, which is also stupid. Like, we need something nuanced in between. But what I think I saw over this arc of, 2015 to 20 or something, was Facebook was taking civil society criticism and criticism in the press and from academia very seriously and trying to make changes. And no matter how many changes they made, they still got yelled at the exact same amount. And eventually, again, I'm not inside Facebook, I'm speculating, eventually the execs were like, forget this. Like, why do we keep making these accommodations if it never wins us anything? Let's just do whatever makes the most money, or let's just do what makes powerful governments happy so they'll leave us alone. Or, what that's a caricature. But I think there is a situation where people who want to be thoughtful critics of platforms and shape what they do, you need carrots and sticks. Like, it can't just be that they can't possibly win.
My last statement on that is I think we mush together election integrity policies with science. There's a difference between somebody lying about an election versus unsettled science around COVID. And I think some of the conversations, to your point, Matt, were unhelpful, that we labeled everything misinformation. And I think from that, mistakes were made. And we're now in the place now where I worry that we don't have some of the safeguards that I would like us to have. But anyway, that's a personal opinion. Sorry for making you stand so long.
No worries. Hello, thank you so much for coming today. My name is Sophia, and I study physics and philosophy at Brown.
Yes.
Awesome.
Thank you. My question is twofold with relation to the implications of AI on society. Firstly, I was wondering if, in terms of tech policy, you differentiate between shorter-term harms like, say, AI ethics-related work like fairness and bias versus more longer-term existential safety concerns in terms of policy making. And then secondly, I was curious if, for companies like, for example, OpenAI, if you would recommend more of an internal policy-making procedure, or if that would be something that should be regulated by the government, or some combination of the two. Mm-hmm.
That question was chef's kiss. Thank you. Come on, team.
I've talked so much.
Zeeb.
So I'll just sort of start narrowly on the second question, mostly to give my brilliant other panelists time to think about the answer to the first, which is actually in relation to what, Matt, you were saying about there being sort of competition in content moderation. I think that probably is right, except if there are certain harms that we think are harms that, like, for which there shouldn't be competition, then there should be government regulation. So recently I was at meetings with some OpenAI execs. We were talking about their election strategy, and one of the points that was brought up, which was really interesting, was, OpenAI is actually thinking quite critically about sort of technical safeguards that can be put up to make sure that their large language models are not being used to produce and then ultimately spread lots of election-related disinformation. Now, the response was, if you're a sophisticated actor, then why would you use ChatGPT? And so if we think that this is something that we should regulate, then we should regulate it. And if not, and we're okay with there being competition and different platforms or different LLMs having different sets of safeguards, then we should move in that direction. But I sort of bias a little bit more towards there are certain harms that should be regulated and that we actually don't want competition.
Well, and I would also say, I'm not an AI regulation expert, but that the hype around AI has made feels like this need to regulate it right the hell now. And I think there are certain laws on the books that do apply to AI, and we should be thinking about what laws are currently in existence, right? And maybe if there was a national privacy law, that would help too. So I would just say that there seems to be this hype that is driving almost mania around regulation, and so that's something to think about.
I'll speak briefly to the short-term interest, long-term interest thing. So, private corporations are supposed to maximize value for shareholders, and that sucks in many ways, right? But it means that if you want to incentivize good behavior, you need to convince them that it is in the long-term interest of their shareholders. And sometimes that means we're going to organize a boycott and all the advertisers are going to leave you unless you do this, using the sort of economic levers of activism. Or sometimes it means public shaming that leads to potential changes in regulatory backlash that hurts their interest, using the sort of normative and democratic mechanisms. Sometimes it means, here's a gentler example, is as platforms are thinking about their ranking algorithms, and are they just going to optimize for engagement and keeping you staring and clicking as long as possible, or should there be other metrics that they consider, like retention over a year, because if you get grossed out and leave from seeing too many grisly accidents or whatever it is that you get from clicking with your lizard brain, maybe that's not in the long-term interest of the company. So that, there are things where you can look at things that seem revenue positive and convince them it's actually not revenue positive in the longer term. And then there are things where you use those external market pressures, democratic pressures, normative pressures to try to change how they can expect to make money or not make money.
I think some of the exciting stuff here really happens in the weeds. I have, for a long time, wished I knew as much about the First Amendment as Daphne does, and particularly in the last 6 months, and maybe in the last 2 weeks, that desire has gotten more and more acute. Because there have been a set of recent cases that I think have lots of problems with them, but I think force a different level of rigor between a government's interest in regulating and then the thing they actually do. And I think that for me is the takeaway from some of these cases. Is like, you can't just say X is bad and then regulate it and expect to survive First Amendment scrutiny. Judges are bringing to account, I think, legislators who are sort of regulating, I think, in a sort of casual way. The scholarship that people like Zeev and his center do, I think, is so important because it actually can make that nexus clearer, where you actually understand more about, like, well, if we're going to regulate algorithms with a goal of doing X, Y, Z, we should actually know how algorithms perform in practice. And if we're not able to demonstrate with some amount of evidence or level of certainty that the thing that we're doing is going to advance that governmental interest, it's not going to survive First Amendment scrutiny.
There's an interesting China angle to this debate that I've observed more as an outsider, but I increasingly may be weighing into this, which is the CEO of Palantir had a New York Times op-ed a few weeks ago, which talked about the existential risk posed by AI, and it was framed around China. And when I'm in meetings with civil society digital harms groups, they are increasingly pushing back against the existential threat advocates, particularly the invocation of national security, and arguing there are near-term harms that we need to focus on that have to do with marginalized communities and algorithmic bias and privacy and all the ways in which there are near-term issues and there are tools potentially, a federal privacy law, for example, and that invoking the existential risk factor and particularly saying everything is fine as long as it's American and it's not a certain bad actor in another country, that is increasingly causing, I think, a backlash from civil society that's trying to sort of focus the conversation on what are the near-term harms that we may have tools to address in other ways.
Okay, I'm going to ask the last question. So if anybody is thinking about coming to the microphone, come to the microphone. But as somebody who supervises students, what I love is helping students think about capstone research projects and other things. I think we have all discussed that a lot of the discussions about tech policy happen in the absence of strong empirical foundations. And I think, when you talk about OpenAI, I think a lot about the failure. At the moment, we're not doing enough to research how AI is impacting local communities. Like, a lot of this conversation is up here, but what actually is happening in Providence for people who don't understand how AI is shaping their worlds. And so I just wondered, again, another quick rapid response, like, if you were back here and you had to do a capstone project, what would you be studying and why?
Can you start on that side this time?
Yeah.
I got one. That's good. So traditional international relations scholar, just actually in the course of the conversations today, so thank you again, Claire. I've been really fascinated at thinking about companies as actors in the international system. And a really interesting thing for some of you to look at is, like, any tech company with a policy function will periodically put out policy blog posts, basically setting out their positions on certain issues, whether that's legislation or kind of a bigger global trend like AI. The big companies do it a lot. And I think it'd be fascinating to analyze those company statements using the same tools and same frameworks that you use to analyze basically state policy positions and see how they're similar and how they're different and how they demonstrate companies doing foreign policy.
You should use ChatGPT to take all of Facebook's newsroom releases over the last 10 years and map the changes. Anyway, I just had that idea.
Gosh, I'm thinking a lot lately about public confidence in public officials being so low, right? And confidence in our government being so low. I'd also be interested in that on the state and local level, especially as we see sort of Congress sort of grind to a halt on a lot of issues. I think we're going to see a rise in legislation at the state and local level. And so I'd be interested in sort of that dynamic of if that is playing out in the local levels and why. So that's something I'd look at.
So a lot of what I work on is what companies are actually going to do in response to laws as opposed to what the lawmakers probably wanted them to do. And the sort of classic example of this is when there are laws saying platforms, you have to take down illegal stuff if you know about it. Then you get patterns of abusive notices, as they're known in the industry, people writing into platforms and saying, take that down, it's illegal. And sometimes it's literally somebody hired by the government of Ecuador to get critical journalism taken down. Sometimes it is competitors trying to silence each other. Sometimes it is corrupt politicians trying to hide news coverage. Sometimes it's somebody who's right, that really is illegal speech. But guess what? The motivation of the platforms is to just take all of that down in order to avoid risk to themselves. So a law that's that simple backfires in this very predictable way. And even explaining that much, policymakers are always like, what? No, we'll just tell them what to do and they'll do it. So recently I saw some really interesting economic modeling by James Grimmelman and a co-author whose name I'm unfortunately forgetting, about just setting out like, just purely as a matter of rationality, not research about what platforms do, but if the law says X, what would you expect them to do with content? And it was just so, it was such a relief to see something so clear and mathematical and straightforward about how rules lead to consequences different from the expected consequences. So I would love to see more efforts like that to be really pragmatic about consequences of platform regulation.
On the capstone question, I think my answer would be about designing regulation to survive First Amendment scrutiny in areas like child safety or speech issues related to generative AI, like election content. Can I go back and answer the question that we all were silent for about the hardest issue thing? Because I've been thinking about that. So I think there's one of the reasons I wanted to go back to it is because I think this has been like a pretty substantive discussion, I think, and there's a substantive answer to that. So like I worked on the Snowden disclosures. When those happened, I led the competition policy team at Facebook at a time when like the universe was calling for us, I guess they still are, to be broken up. That was very difficult work. But I don't think the hardest issue that I faced in my time in industry was substantive. It was actually my inadequacies as a manager of a team. So as I succeeded in the company, I ended up essentially getting responsibility for leading a policy development team. And I don't think I did that very well. I don't know, and I was definitely perceived within the company to not be doing that well. And I think it's true. I mean, it's true. And I highlight that in part because I think when you're sitting in the position that you're sitting in, and I feel like this is also kind of the nature of a lot of academic criticism of tech companies is you just need to be smarter and more ethical. You guys in your position, you have succeeded, you're in the seats that you're in because you are smart, you have done very well in school, you have performed in a certain kind of way excellently. And I think in a corporate world, but not just a corporate world, in government, in civil society organizations, really any organization that you're in, there are a whole set of other skills that were not a part of any component of my education that are important to build over time that I think are real drivers of success in those environments. And that for me, I think I've sort of wrestled with the Snowden fallout stuff. I sort of think I have ideas about that. I've wrestled with the challenges of being in the antitrust world in the way that I was. I don't think I've really fully processed what it meant to feel like I was kind of letting down the people on my team and unable to succeed for them in a way that that was gratifying. So I would encourage you as you embark on your careers to sort of build those skills that are not about the smartness of your work, but are about how you work in teams and with other people.
I'm going to follow Matt by answering the other question. And something that I think I'd love to bring into the conversation about career and education and your path is about, and one thing that I think is the hardest thing that I've grappled with as a professional is how to be a present mother and pursue a big career. And there are a lot of sort of simplistic answers to this, from the lean in to the Anne-Marie Slaughter, we actually can't have it all, and how do you reckon with that? And one of the things that I think has been the hardest, but I am the most proud of in my career, is it's not just that I have 2 young kids and I'm there for them, but when I'm with them, I feel like I'm truly present as much as I possibly can, in that I'm not scrolling through my phone, or I'm trying, this is my aspiration, but when I get it, I think, yes, this is the thing that I'm the most proud of, is that I am emotionally, spiritually, mentally present with you in these moments. And then I'm gonna run around the world and do big things that I'm really proud of. And being able to sort of do all of that at once, I think requires superpowers. And I think I have it, and I aspire to, and I am the most proud of that, but it's not linear. I mean, I am constantly feeling like I'm failing at one or the other, but just being candid about it and trying to hold myself to that standard.
In terms of capstone projects, one of the things that we were chatting about, and incredible answer, hard to go.
I don't mean to undermine the importance of a capstone project.
Is we were chatting earlier around, especially when it comes to trying to identify online harms, or like what are the harms, whether it's polarization or other issue areas that we care about, that are caused by some of these technologies, is what's the evidentiary standard for us to sort of make causal claims in this context? And so I think on the one hand, there's sort of the non-rigorous, but I think understandable approach, which is you just go online and you find things that seem bad and you say that obviously causes harm. And then on the other hand, we sort of, I think, draw too much at times in the social sciences from the natural sciences and think, well, the only evidentiary standard is to run something like a randomized controlled trial where we're really able to get serious causal purchase on being able to make statements about harms. And unfortunately, that's really challenging to do when 20 years later, like you can't like randomly assign someone onto Facebook or not. You can do some deactivation studies, but there are all sorts of methodological issues with actually making sort of inferences from those. And so the question that I would have is like, I mean, I think I'm drawing from you studying both physics and philosophy, which is very cool, is like, what would the evidentiary standard be for us to feel comfortable about making sort of causal claims around harms, knowing that some of the standards that we use in the hard sciences might not be able to be met here?
Thank you. I think you have the floor, sir.
Awesome. Thank you for the awesome panel, by the way. So I have only one question, but just to get your general ideas about a recent trend that is happening with, I guess, online activity and social media is I'm not quite sure whether this trend is significant, is the trend of decentralization of platforms. Mastodon, Blabby, whatever, maybe it will die out soon, but it is interesting in terms of how it is run by people from all over the world. I'm assuming it's because of the nature of decentralization itself. And I wonder what your thoughts are in terms of the complexity of regularization for these decentralization platforms, because the actual server, the actual data themselves are spread out all over the world. So they are subject to different international regulation, as well as how you study them, because each one of those data server, whatever, are from different countries. So accessing them and how you study them might potentially have some implication about privacy or certain data you can or cannot process across like international boundaries. Yeah.
Thank you. What a great question.
So this is something I work on a lot. I think I'm a big fan of decentralized systems like that, mostly because I just really believe that having very concentrated power over public discourse in the hands of a small handful of companies, that is going to be abused. This is my history background, right? Like thinking that we can leave that incredible concentration of power and not expect it to be abused seems crazy to me. Cool, and these decentralized models like Mastodon and like Blue Sky, which is sort of, they escaped from Twitter just in time to be this interesting spinoff. The idea is you can still be in touch with all the same people you were in touch with. You don't lose your social network and your contacts to your aunt in Oklahoma or whatever. But you can choose to be on an instance or to have a particular version you subscribe to that has your preferred rules for speech and content moderation and ranking. So you can say, I want the Disney flavor of content moderation, but I also want an overlay from this feminist organization of, interspersing certain anti-princess things or whatever. And it's great because it, again, decentralizes this power over discourse. It also has a whole bunch of downsides. If what you're worried about is echo chambers, this allows people to self-isolate. If they want to be in the all hate speech all the time channel, they can be there. They can as a First Amendment matter, they can as a technological matter. There are also some practical barriers, which is one of the things that I write about a bunch, like how do you handle privacy? How do you handle revenue? How do you handle the cost of content moderation? Does every single node need to have a Farsi speaker? That's not sustainable. So there are a bunch of practical issues, but I kind of love this because it gets out of the model of, well, either the platforms are going to make the rules or else the government will come in and pass a law that makes the rules on a top-down basis and instead diversifies that. And if you are a platform or a node operating in Thailand, for example, and it is unlawful to share certain kinds of criticism of the Thai king, then your node can be the one that does take that down, but the other node, the node operating in Brazil doesn't have to do that.
Do you have a question?
Hi, thank you for coming tonight. I just have a question on as we see young people as a parent, right? I question when should I allow my child on social media, et cetera, but interested on your thoughts on sort of the timeliness of when people post things and then decade, 2 decades later, sometimes those things come back to haunt people as society shifts, right? At the time it was deemed okay, 20, say 30 maybe years later now, maybe it's not, as people enter the workforce, a lot of young people are on there, and just kind of your thoughts on like how should we regulate any of that, like there be a time limit on what's allowed to be held, et cetera, so thank you.
Thank you. That's an awesome question. I love it. The answer is different for everyone in terms of, what age. Not below 13, because in this country, that's when the COPPA, that's the limit for platforms in terms of children's privacy law. But the answer is going to be different for every kid, and every parent needs to know that. But I'll say, one of the tempting things about social media, particularly influencer-flavored social media, is that it gives people, I think, the false impression that, like, you have to have your opinions on the record at all time, and you have to, like, voice something, and it's associated with you, and you have to have a personal brand. I think that's dangerous, and I don't think that that's necessary. I don't have a Twitter account. People aren't entitled to my thoughts at all times, and I think it's good just to keep some things to oneself. On the other hand, this is where kind of platform diversity comes in, where you can have an anonymous platform and you can use that to, share things that aren't necessarily going to be tied back to you forever and ever. And you can still participate in those debates and have real meaningful learnings without having to be so stressed about, the world changing around you and being held to things that you said when you were 18 or 19.
Should we have a right to be forgotten law? I've forgotten that European thing. Any views on things should disappear automatically after 10 years?
I was still at Google when the right to be forgotten ruling came down, and then I spent 2 years straight working on it.
Can you just quickly explain it? Because I think people have forgotten actually what that was.
Yeah, so this was it's a really interesting ruling, and I'm sympathetic to many parts of it. It said, sometimes there are things that have been published on a website that are perfectly legal to publish on the website, and in this case, it was a bankruptcy announcement in a newspaper's website. but making them findable in web search so that anyone can find it really fast anytime they're curious about this person, that goes too far in kind of the balance of the privacy harms to the person versus the information access benefits of having the information out there. That goes too far. So sometimes there are things you have to take out of web search even though they're still on the website. And you can kind of analogize that to discussions about amplification, right? Like maybe sometimes there are things as a moral matter, I think it's hard as a legal matter here, but that are okay to host on Twitter, but shouldn't be boosted in the algorithm quite as much because, you know, we think differently about the cost-benefit analysis of the harms when it's amplified. Anyhow, so the part of it that I'm sympathetic to of the right to be forgotten is I would be fine if people had some legal rights to silence, to take down things that they posted when they were a dumb 17-year-old. I think it would be really hard under US law. I'm not sure that is achievable, but you know, for my personal balance of what I think would be okay, I'm quite sympathetic to that. And I don't think we could do that as a First Amendment matter, or not a very good version of it. But you know, if you want to convince platforms that as an ethical matter, that's what they should do, that might be a perfectly viable thing for them to adopt. The thing that was problematic in the right to be forgotten, or that I've cared about most, was that the court was like, there's a brand new rule. You have to take down speech that always used to be legal. Now it's illegal on web search. We're going to give you about 3 sentences explaining what this rule is. And now everyone can ask web search to take this down. And like, you decide behind closed doors what this rule is going to be. You know, didn't have a mechanism for public adjudication or for, you know, constitutional accountability or human rights accountability or democratic processes. Like anything where you set a new rule and then say, go forth and enforce it, platforms, I'm sure you'll do a good job. That's not a good system as I see it.
Thank you. Now, I've got one question from the live stream that I need to ask because it's a right to reply question about Reddit's API. Because we talked about it earlier, which was, as many of you know, it's now increasingly difficult, as Eva said, to do research. And the person is asking, why did you stop API access to Reddit? And earlier you said that was not the case. So I just wanted to make sure that you clarify that.
So there is still API access to Reddit. And in fact, if you are a non-commercial researcher, there is free access to the Reddit API. What we had to put a stop to was people using, and frankly, abusing the API for commercial purposes and, you know, building businesses off of it where we bear all of the costs. And when I talk about costs, it's, you know, infrastructure costs of, you know, having to you know, every hit to our API, you know, costs us money. And so people were building commercial apps as an alternative to the Reddit app where you could use it to view Reddit content, and they were actually taking the Reddit ads out of it and then inserting their own ads. So like these were actual businesses where they incurred no costs, and you know that's clearly not fair. So what we did is saying if you are using it for commercial purposes, you have to pay for that. But if you're using it for non-commercial research, academic research, for building moderation bots, for accessibility apps, that's all still continued to be supported and free.
So do your capstone projects on Reddit, I think is what we're learning from here. Thank you for an incredible conversation. It really was so rich. I think we could all do with a sandwich and maybe a glass of wine. So not to say that you're here for the free food, but we do have some delicious food outside. Hello. Oh, Stephanie's going to do some closing. But I have been told in my notes that you can take a mug from the table. Stephanie, some closing remarks.
Well, I know I'm what stands between you and the nibbles and the drinks and everybody at home, their families, but wanted to just say thank you, an amazing thank you to all of you for joining us here, sharing not just your knowledge and expertise, but these real world lessons. Thanks for all of you for taking the time, obviously, and for caring about this topic. Our tagline at the IFL is building a better future for our information spaces, one pilot at a time. And I feel like, as we've seen from this conversation, that's going to take a little bit of time. as we've seen, everybody here brings a unique perspective to this question. And one thing I've learned is that clearly you can, there are as many ways to build your Brown experience as there are Brown students, and there are as many ways to build a career after Brown as there are Brown graduates probably. And we've heard that there's many things you learn in college, and then there's the other things that you can't learn in college, because life outside is different and it throws curveballs at us. The context matters, the timing matters. We're answering these questions and building our careers in the context of what's going on in the world. And they don't happen in a vacuum, right? What we do and what we think rhymes with history. There's a 9/11 or a pandemic or a climate crisis or wars in the Ukraine and now the Middle East that change the context, and therefore they change our responses. I thought that was really helpful that you all pointed this out. And if I've learned anything from the pandemic and being at the White House for the past year, it was that there's some things we can't plan for. We sometimes think there ought to be a playbook for anything, and especially in academia, we work incredibly hard to create the playbooks, and we need to try to create the playbooks. And then there's the problem solving that comes in a crisis. The other thing that really stuck out to me tonight is about the importance of cultural differences and cultural perspectives and how we all look at these challenges in different ways. And I stand here as a German. The book Mein Kampf wasn't available for 50 years in my country because we thought that just wasn't something that anybody should be reading. On what basis did we make that decision? Everybody knows the history, but there was also 50 years later a moment where people said that actually no longer should be the case. Everybody should be able to read this book. There's so many examples of this, as all of you have pointed out. On the AI front, for example, one I've been obsessed with as a European is in the US, machine learning is considered a black box. We can't know what happens inside of it. In Europe, people talk about explainability. It costs money. Are we going to invest in it or not? So just being aware of our frameworks and the frameworks of others. And we talked a bit about diversity, right? And that is why we need diversity. And we don't just need diversity of disciplines. We need diversity of backgrounds. We need diversity of experience and expertise. We need to value all those different perspectives, especially those of people that often don't have a voice but are being affected by the decisions that are being made. And then one last thing that I think also stuck out to me from the conversation is, like, we've done a little bit of Bo Bruntham tonight, right? Welcome to the internet. Take a look around. Everything can be found. Everything for everyone all the time is technically possible, but is it desirable? Is it what we want? And as we build a different future for our information spaces, how are we thinking about that? The answers will come from everywhere. And we've seen great community conversations here tonight. And we heard from Jessica about this idea that maybe we need to create smaller units in which we can come together as people in relationships, have agency, and we can't figure out a one-size-fits-all solution for the entire world, which is a geopolitically complicated space, right? So thank you all for giving us a lot to think about. Thank you all for taking this forward. Come visit us at the IFL. If you want to spend more time with these types of questions, the Information Futures Lab at the School of Public Health is here for everybody. It doesn't matter if you're an undergrad or graduate, and we look forward to working with all of you. Thank you, guys.